the theatre of the mind was an actual place. Could players just create what they wanted to be? Hello adventurers, I am the Welsh DM, the one Welshman whose accent did die as part of a TPK. And in a world where we're constantly told to be perfect, I say no. Let's just be good enough. It's time for another video in the How to Be an OK GM series. The series that reminds you that you don't need to put so much pressure on yourself, just have a good time, and that being okay is good enough. For games like D&D and Pathfinder, combat is the meat and potatoes of the system and the way in which the narrative really takes leaps forward. The majority of the system is built around clashing swords and slinging spells. Even more narrative systems like Powered by the Apocalypse and Blades in the Dark still have combat as an expected encounter. So regardless of the system you are using, there will inevitably come a moment where words have failed the party and the only solution is to raise your fists and get into a brawl. And unfortunately, we can all as GMs end up putting a lot of pressure on ourselves when it comes to planning and running combat encounters. We want them to be memorable and dramatic, but are also worried about them becoming slow and boring. Well, what if I were to tell you that it doesn't need to be that difficult, it doesn't need to be that stressful, and being okay is probably going to be fine. I want to help you feel ready, confident, and comfortable when it comes to running combat encounters for your next TTRPG campaign. The first question we have to ask is, do we actually need combat for the story we're telling and the game we are running? Fighting monsters might be the core pillar of D&D and its offspring systems, but it doesn't mean it's always the right challenge for every situation. Combat allows us to pit our players against dangerous monsters for a variety of reasons. Whether it's animalistic monstrosities in the forests around the town that are making travel difficult, or villainous monsters with grand plans stealing all the treasure from the people. But there are many other situations that encourage other ways of solving the challenge that isn't just drawing a sword and slaying the foe. So we want to make sure that what we're doing in the narrative necessitates the need for violence and combat. Regardless, we are going to assume, for the sake of this video, that combat is what's needed for this story beat. Which means we need to figure out what this combat will look like and what our players are going to be fighting. There are so many ways to get inspired, but my personal favourite, and the favourite of many GMs throughout history, is to grab your copy of the monster manual, open it up, and just start flicking through the pages. Between the detailed descriptions of the monsters, the gorgeous artwork, and the really diverse mechanics, there is bound to be something in there that gets you excited to put a monster in a combat encounter. Do you think the random eye ray feature of the Beholder is fun and chaotic? Well then put that in your combat encounter. Do you love the art of the Merrow for being aggressive, dark and shark-like? Well find a reason to have a combat encounter by the coast where the players have their stuff stolen by Merrow. And if you throw in third-party publishers like Ghostfire Gaming or Kobold Press, you'll probably have thousands of monsters to choose from and get inspired by, even if you're not running D&D. Of course, there are other ways to get cool ideas for your combats. Go watch movies and TV shows with great fight scenes and take inspiration from that. Go look at art online on Reddit, ArtStation and Pinterest and see what wonderful fantasy artists have produced to inspire you. Or just go watch other TTRPG actual plays and see what kind of stuff they're doing with combat encounters to fuel your own creative ideas. And don't be ashamed to just steal things and put them one for one into your game if you thought it was cool and fun. That is a rule that a lot of people forget. If you think it's fun and cool, odds are your players will too, and you'll have a great time. No need to stress about making it fun. While I'll never say force your players into a combat encounter just because you made it, if you're going to make one, make it badass and memorable. We're inspired, we're excited, we're ready to rock. Unfortunately, we do need to do a little bit of preparation before actually going to game night to make sure the combat encounter really pops the way we want it to. Exactly how this looks will vary from system to system. D&D and Pathfinder have very mechanical, mathematical methods of encounter preparation to hit the desired challenge, while something like Blades in the Dark is much more reliant on the narrative shaping the kind of combat and being fairly vague with how that difficulty rating comes into effect. So, before you get too deep into the weeds of planning your encounter, it can be worth going back to the source material and reading that chapter of the rulebook just to refresh yourself as to what the game expects from this kind of challenge. A game like D&D is very reliant on its action economy, which means a fight with a large, big monster at the centre will play very differently from one that has 6 or 7 goblins running around. And they will be very different for you to manage behind the screen as well. But enough talk about rules, mechanics and systems. We're ultimately here to tell cool stories with our friends. When we were getting inspired a moment ago, we probably thought more than just about the monster at the heart of the combat. We thought about why the fight was happening, or where it was happening. What environment does this combat take place in? What are the goals of the invested parties? And what are the narrative beats that are going to shape individuals' actions? Is this fight happening on a mountainside? Well, consider what the winds are going to do, the tall cliffs, and what happens if someone falls off them. How will the players use this to their own advantage? Is the fight between childhood friends that ended up going down different paths? One became the villain, the other one the shining paladin. How will their shared histories shape their own actions and dictate the results of the fight? Is there a chance for mercy? Are the party actually here just to get an artifact and escape? Well then the challenge is not to face the warlord one-on-one, but to overcome their wards and locks and escape before the guard's alarm is raised. You don't need to consider all of these elements into every combat encounter, but it's worth including 1 or 2 just because it adds depth to the encounter and forces your players to think of an in-world reason for their actions. All of this is to say, the best way to avoid a combat encounter becoming stale and boring is to give it a reason to exist, or give it an extra element for the people to interact with. Giving them something that isn't just the mechanics of the system or what's on their character sheet. Now, running a combat encounter can be really stressful, and as a GM we tend to put a lot of undue pressure on ourselves to make it dramatic and memorable. In a combat-centric like D&D or Pathfinder, there can be a lot of spinning plates between controlling the monsters, passing the baton between players through initiative, handling the ongoing narrative, as well as many other things besides. So my chief advice for anyone looking to become more comfortable and confident when running combat encounters is slow down. Take a breath, relax a little, remember it's not a race. Everyone is here to have fun, and they probably already are. This can sound counterintuitive. After all, one of the common complaints about D&D is that its combat is quite slow. But tell that voice to be quiet, tell the internet trolls to go away, and trust me, you have more time than you think. Take your time, be deliberate with your actions, and evocative with your descriptions. Allow your players a chance to describe their own actions and build the wonderful scene and narrative with you. Combat only tends to feel slow and dull when it becomes about number crunching and no more about the story. Stay in the narrative, add to the story, and drag your players with you into the world. With this, it can be occasionally useful to just reset the scene. This means taking a quick pause from the blow-by-blow individual people's turns and actions to just re-describe everything that's going on. Give an update on the state of the monsters, on the players, of the ongoing effects in the room, so that everyone can recenter and get back to a shared imagery of the entire scene. Again, it's helping people center in on the narrative. Now, it's worth mentioning at this point, just because you plan for an encounter to go a certain way doesn't mean it has, and it almost certainly has not. Which reminds me of a quote that Matt Colville said in an old video once. Encounter design doesn't end just because initiative was rolled. As the common phrase goes, no plan survives contact with the enemy, or in the case of TTRPGs, no plan survives contact with the players or the dice. Players are going to act in ways you didn't expect, the dice are going to swing wildly from left to right, and things you thought would have dramatic impact end up not. That's fine, don't worry about it, that's the game side of a TTRPG playing out. Just go with the flow. Be willing to cut bits that you had planned if the encounter is too strong, or be willing to add additional elements if it's not going the way that you wanted. These moments shouldn't be pre-planned, they should be creative based on the mood and tension at the table, as well as the narrative that is ongoing. This is a learned skill. You're not going to have this down right away, but the more you do it, the more comfortable you'll become. And when you do become comfortable with it, it'll make your actual pre-session planning a lot less stressful because you'll realise you don't need to come up with every eventuality beforehand. With these subtle nudges in the encounter, you can make it seem far more balanced and nuanced than it probably was when you first designed it. Call it a hack, a cheat, whatever you want, just don't tell the players. Let them think you're a genius of combat design. Before we finish the video, I've got a handful of quick tips to help you reach that perfect okay level for your combats without really adding any additional effort or complexity. Music. Music makes everything better. Think of your favourite piece of cinema, whether it's the Ride of the Rohirrim or John Wick fighting through a nightclub. Music adds to the scene and draws us in. It's a great way to add tension and keep the tempo of the fight moving with no real effort. There is a load of YouTube channels out there that create specific music and ambience for D&D and other TTRPG campaigns. I personally like Bardify as a really quick and deep source. For On-Road Stories, I make use of Tabletop Audio, who produce 10-minute long soundtracks of varying different ambiances, including some absolutely amazing combat ones. Both of them will be in the description below. Or if you don't want to handle it yourself, just ask one of your players to put their favourite video game soundtrack on. Video game music is designed to keep people focused, the tempo high and the tension higher still. So whether it's Elden Ring, Hades, Castlevania, Legend of Zelda, all of them will serve perfectly for your combat. Descriptions. If, like me, you're kind of iffy when it comes to adjectives to describe players and monsters' attacks, go check out Arcane Anthems on Patreon. They too are a wonderful music resource, so do check them out for that, but a while ago they released a document of better descriptions for TTRPGs. It's basically just a table of the different damage types in D&D with a dozen or so adjectives to describe that kind of damage. Perfect from the moment where you can't quite figure out what necrotic, radiant or psychic damage would actually look like when applied. It is a staple of my DM screen now and a brilliant fallback for where my brain is completely switched off in the middle of a combat. The other thing to consider is find a way to remove some of those spinning plates that I mentioned earlier from your combat tracking. Anything you can do to make the transition into combat smoother is a really great help. A lot of people like to pre-roll the initiative for their big encounters because it allows them to just hear what the players' initiatives are and slot them in with their monsters. Plus, it has the added benefit of potentially rigging it to make sure that your really cool monster's ability gets to go nice and early in the combat just to set the tone. After all, we don't want the beholder dying before it gets to shoot an eye ray. Similarly, find what works for you when it comes to hit point tracking if that's what the system requires. I personally prefer to count down from the hit point maximum to 0, it's more satisfying for me. Other people prefer to count up because they find addition easier than subtraction. Neither method is correct, it is entirely a preference, and at the end of the day, don't worry about your math skills, what's 1 or 2 hit points between friends. And lastly, remember the cardinal rule of TTRPGs. Rulings, not rules. Avoid being beholden to the system in its entirety. If there is a cool moment that happens that you're going to spend ages figuring out the exact mechanics to allow it to happen, forget the mechanics, find a workaround, and let the momentum stay. At the end of the day, we want to tell cool, dramatic moments, so why let the system bog us down and distract us? If you want to look it up after the game, great, but in the moment, keep the tempo going, keep people in the scene, and just support the cool moments. Rule of cool is not just a thing players say to justify their insane ideas, it's a way for you to keep the narrative really interesting and engaging. At the end of the day, don't let the system get in the way of the fun. And that's it. That's what I've got for running okay combat encounters in your TTRPG adventures. There's plenty more advice out there for running fun, engaging, and dramatic combat encounters, so take a look around, see what works for you and your players. But do remember, being okay is probably good enough. Anyway, I want to hear from you. What is your favourite combat encounter that you've either run or been a part of? Was it a deeply complex puzzle encounter with a shifting room and traps firing at you all of the time? Or was it just a bar brawl that got out of hand that was deeply funny when people started throwing popcorn in the ring? Let me know in the comments below what your favourite is and share funny, memorable stories as well as any advice you have for other GMs out there. We've now covered one pillar of D&D's 3-pillar system, so I think we'll cover social and exploration in the next couple of OKGM videos, but do let me know if there's any other topics you would like to see covered in this series. As always, if you enjoyed the video, please do give it a like. It does appease the very angry algorithm that's currently standing behind my camera, shaking an axe at me. And if you enjoy this kind of content, please do subscribe to the whole channel and hit the bell notification icon to make sure you never miss a video. Anyway, I do believe that's everything. I certainly hope you now feel confident enough to go run an okay combat session, at least. In the meantime, you keep an eye out for dragons. I'm going to go see whether I can resurrect my accent. And remember to keep telling stories. I feel like failing to hit record on a video and not realising for 45 minutes is a rite of passage. Music makes not the kind of music I'm talking about. Motorcycle engines don't add to combat.